So welcome to the event today. We are going to wait a few more minutes so that people can join us, and then we will begin in a few minutes. For those who have now joined, we will now start. I think, so welcome to today's online event. My name is Charlotte Kiener. I'm working as an expert and campaigner on arms export control for the German NGO Ohne, Rüstung, Leben, which is one of the members of ENAAT, the European Network Against Arms Trade, and I'm going to moderate today this event. How European weapons fuel armed violence in Mexico. This event was organized by the European Network Against Arms Trade, Ohne, Rüstung, Leben, Rete, Disarmo, and the Comisión Mexicana de Defensa y Promoción de los Derechos Humanos. And I already want to give a special thanks to Francesco Vignarca and Rete, Disarmo for the technical hosting and support of this event. And to make sure that everybody knows, we are going to record this event, and this video will be later available on the YouTube channel of the ENAAT. We will also have time for questions from the audience, so you can already start to write your questions in the chat during the talks of our speakers, and then in the end we will have time to answer them and to engage in a discussion. Today was the second and last day of the third EU CELAC, so the EU Latin American Caribbean States Summit. And one of the aims of this summit has been to strengthen a partnership meant to be based on the shared values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, as well as to advance peace and stability worldwide. However, there is an inconsistency here between the EU's claimed intentions on the one side and the reality of arms sales practices, particularly of small arms and light weapons by European companies on the other side, as these arms sales practices exacerbate armed violence and serious human rights violations in Mexico, as well as in the region. And today, we want to focus on this example of Mexico, because in February 2023, the European Network Against Arms Trade and two of its national members, Ohne, Rüstung, Leben, and Rete, Disarmo, took part in an international delegation to Mexico that was organized by Stop US Arms to Mexico with the support of the Comisión Mexicana de Defensa y Promoción de los Derechos Humanos. And this event is also a follow-up on this delegation. In this mission confirmed that European small arms and light weapons continue fueling armed violence in Mexico, impacting all of the Mexican people. And a significant part of European firearms arrives in Mexico as civilian arms or through other channels such as the US market. And this raises questions about corporate social responsibility and about circumventing the EU common position on arms exports. So therefore, I'm very pleased to have great speakers today from civil society organizations. From Belgium with Laetitia Seydoux, from Germany with Annabel Brünnemann, Mexico, Lucia Chavez, and the US with the John Lindsay Poland to discuss this topic. Unfortunately, it was not possible that a European parliamentarian joins us in the discussion due to time constraints because of the EU Select Summit and parallel Cumbre de los Pueblos. But I will introduce all the speakers in more detail during the event. And we will now first hear 4 interventions by the speakers. We will see several videos with testimonies from Mexican people. And after that, we will have some time for questions from the audience. We start now with Leticia Sedou, who will give us an overview of the developments around small arms exports from Europe to Mexico. Leticia works as the EU program officer on behalf of the European Network Against Arms Trade, and also participated in the international delegation to Mexico I just mentioned. So Leticia, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks you, Charlotte. Thanks a lot. So I'll start with a brief overview of the state of European arms exports, especially the small arms and light weapons, how they are involved in serious human rights violations, and also some specifics of this trade with Mexico and how we in Europe should respond to it, in a nutshell, to have a kind of broad overview. My points are largely based on a report that was done in 2018 called Deadly Trade, How European and Israeli Arms Exports are Accelerating Violence in Mexico. And that I invite you to read for more details. It's available on the Stop US Arms to Mexico website, and we can share that on the chat later on. More recent figures about arms exports to Mexico show that the main findings of this report remain unfortunately accurate. And I'll maybe start sharing a bit of my screen for a moment. Here we are. Okay. So we can see here that in the period 2006 to 2018, European countries have been exporting significant quantities of small arms and light weapons to Mexico. They exported more than 200,000 firearms for the use of state and municipal police in the 32 Mexican states. And during that same period, state violence and homicides have increased dramatically. And Lucia will tell us more about that. More than half of the weapons sold in that period came from just 2 companies, Rete in Italy and Glock in Austria. And then this was followed by companies from Germany, the Czech Republic, and Belgium for the main ones. Italy is one of the top 3 exporters of small arms, and in particular weapons for the civilian markets that do not require authorization and are the most widespread weapons in Mexico after the US. These weapons have been used by the police in multiple serious human rights violations, including in the enforced disappearance of the 43 students in Ayotzinapa, and the Iguala police at the time had 73 Beretta assault rifles. Beretta weapons are also found their way in the illegal markets, and between 2010 and 2020, for example, more than 2,700 firearms recovered by the Mexican army were identified as Italian. As regards Germany, one of the most known cases is, of course, the Eckler & Koch case, where rifles between 2006 and 2009, Eckler & Koch exported more than 10,000 G30 assault rifles and spare parts to Mexico. The rifles were intended for police units in different Mexican states, but excluding Guerrero, Jalisco, Chiapas, and Chihuahua due to human rights concerns, according to the authorization for arms exports from the German government. However, proof was brought that nearly half of these exported G36 ended up in exactly those 4 states. This led ultimately to a criminal conviction in 2019 of former Heckler & Koch employees due to illegal arms exports and a fine of 3.5 million euros for the company. Yet the police forces in Iguala, in the state of Guerrero, used G36 rifles in the attack of students of the Ayotzinapa Normal School in 2014. About Belgium, despite being a small country, it produces a wide range of military equipment. It's mainly firearms and ammunition that are exported to Mexico, mostly from one company, the Fédération Nationale Herstal, better known as FN, which, by the way, the holding also owns Minimi and Browning. According to Mexican data, more than 8,000 FN weapons were imported into Mexico between 2008 and 2019. And more than half were machine guns for the army. But there were also more than 1,000 firearms intended for the police, in particular a model called 5.7. More than half were received by the police of Jalisco, Jalisco being one of the states where Germany didn't want to export. Jalisco is also where the largest number of weapons were reported stolen or lost by the police, and the state that received the most of Beretta weapons in the same period. But FN weapons are also very popular with the cartel, in particular this FN 5.7, which has the ability to pierce standard bulletproof vests from a distance of 200 meters, which explains the interest of both the police, but also that it's widely used by organized crime, where it is known as the cop killer. The former Tijuana cartel leader, Arellano Felix, was shown to be in possession of such matapolicías. And cartels like the Gulf Cartel, Zetas, or Jalisco New Generation are known to use those weapons. In March 2013, the gunman who murdered journalist Jaime Guadalupe used an FN 5.7. So these are just a few examples of the impact of European weapons on the human rights situation in Mexico. There are more cases in the report, and surely even more unknown ones, due to the difficulty to document the cases and identify the weapons. It's also important to underline that these weapons do not only make direct victims, but also indirect ones. And we will hear more about that in a moment. I will end with data about the more recent years. Let me share my screen again. Next slide. Okay, I don't know why. Yeah, here is the next one. Okay. So according to official data from European governments, there was a significant reduction in the number of license or authorization and their values since 2018. But what was more interesting to check was the reports of the Mexican government to the ATT, to the Arms Trade Treaty, where we can see that from 2019 to 2021, we had over 4,000 small arms and light weapons sold legally from Europe to Mexico, so directly imported from Europe. The majority of those ones were civilian firearms for private use, such as hunting, sporting use, or home protection, which means that the export requirements are less stringent than for military type equipment. But what we see in this graph, which is more interesting, is that these 40,000 represent only a third of the European firearms that legally enter Mexico, as Mexico reported having imported over 120,000 firearms or rifles and machine guns of European-owned brands through different channels. So that means that 2/3 are coming from non-EU countries like Turkey and Japan, but of course mainly from the US. And we will hear more about that also later on. So the number of European brands weapons present in Mexico are much larger than the official figures we get from our governments, either through manufacturing plants in the US or by owning other brands, like Colt being part of a Czech holding, for example. From this Mexican ITT report, we could see about 20 firearms companies or brands that are selling to Mexico and could be considered as European, EU, or Switzerland, according to a first screening. So during the mission that Charlotte mentioned before in the introduction, we raised our concerns with European representatives in Mexico, in particular the Belgian embassy and the EU delegation. And the general outcome of those meetings is a limited, if not complete, lack of interest in addressing this issue, unless it is connected with drug trafficking affecting Europe directly. Our governments are conveniently getting rid of responsibility for weapons going through the US market or illicit trafficking, and transferring responsibility about tracing and control to Mexican authorities, despite knowing the levels of corruption, collusion, or lack of capacities. The case of Mexico is emblematic of the fact that our current arms export control systems are far from guaranteeing a responsible arms trade, and of the multiplicity of channels through which European arms enter Mexico. So it's of particular importance that arms companies are held accountable also throughout the entire value chain of their activities, And we will come back to that later on with another speaker, with Annabelle. So European countries and companies do have both a responsibility to decide whether or not to fuel the dramatic level of violence in Mexico, which is impacting all levels of Mexican society. By continuing to send arms, small arms, light weapons, and ammunition, whatever the channel is, both EU countries and companies are conscious accomplices of those crimes against the Mexican people. So that's why from our end, we call European countries to stop exporting small arms and light weapons, including civilian firearms, to Mexico, in line with the common position that prohibits the exports to nations where they would prolong violent conflicts, or could be used to human rights violation, or could be under risk of diversion. These conditions clearly exist in Mexico and justify suspending exports until the situation improves. EU countries should also hold accountable their EU-based holdings which own firearms company in the US or any other non-EU country to abide by the norms of the common position, including for their non-EU plants, in order to curb the flow of European brand firearms to Mexico. And thus, they remain consistent with the commitment for responsible legal trade of small arms and light weapons that member states took in their 2018 strategy. And now, to conclude, also we call the Parliament and the Council to ensure that the entire value chain of the arms sector is included in the due diligence obligation set out by EU law, regardless whether this was subject to national export controls in the member states or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laetitia, for your contribution and for this overview and of this very interesting and also very concerning trends you've described. You've already mentioned some examples of the impact of European small arms in Mexico, and now we will stay with this topic about the possible consequences of such exports. Because as we all know, behind all these figures and numbers of arms transfers, there can always be like real world human consequences. So in the following, we will now see and hear several testimonies by Mexican people via short videos, and also testimonies by members of the international delegation, because these videos you are now going to see were made during the international delegation to Mexico, and there are more powerful videos that show testimonies that you can see on a YouTube playlist of Stop US Arms to Mexico. We will also share the link later, and there you can also see a 7-minute film called United States and Mexico, the same guns are killing us. After the testimonies, we will then continue with an intervention of Lucia Chavez on gun violence and the human rights situation in Mexico. And Lucia is the executive director of the Mexican Commission for the Defense and Promotion of Human Rights. So now we will going to start with the videos.
If Mexico buys arms, only the Ministry of Defense is allowed to buy arms. These arms go from there, from the Sedena, the Ministry of Defense, to any place in Mexico, and no one knows to where, no? And we know that a lot of police stations, so overall the regional police stations, the local police stations, colluded with the organized crime. So you never know where they go. So I think they should control, and they should think better where they do send and sell their arms. That's one very important thing that should be necessary.
Son las que quedan en medio de esta guerra del narcotráfico, del crimen organizado, porque sabemos que las mujeres también son un territorio, se vuelven un territorio de conquista para aquellos que tienen el poder. En el contexto de Guerrero es que los agresores son estas personas que también forman parte del crimen organizado. Hace unos años, el que era el secretario de gobierno hizo unas declaraciones diciendo que las mujeres asesinadas eran sicarias y que por eso las mataban. Pues ¿cómo podemos tener una búsqueda de justicia si ni siquiera se reconoce la violencia que nosotras vivimos?
Tengo desaparecidos a mi esposo y a mis 2 hijos. A ellos los sacaron forzosamente, así con acto de violencia de mi casa. A mí me pusieron el arma en mi cabeza, llegan rápido y se los llevaron delante de mis 3 niños, que les provenía lo que es el alimento, lo que es el gasto. Y es trabajoso y duro, porque pues no hay para una cosa, no hay para otra, pero pues, como dice, ahí vamos.
A lo mejor ahorita ya puedo decirlo, pero cuando iniciaba llorando, porque lejos de primero acompañar a desaparecidos que nos colocaba en constante amenazas en nuestra propia oficina, llegaban hombres armados, militares, policías a 50 metros, que no hacían nada, solamente veían, y nosotros ahí en medio, se puede decir, del fuego cruzado, porque pues nos podían dar de este lado o de este lado. La oficina es muy pequeña, las ventanas son de vidrio, entonces en cualquier momento podía entrar una bala. En el 2018 se da un desplazamiento grande, el más grande de la historia en México. En ese momento, cuando se desplazaron, eran 1,800 familias de la sierra, pues necesitaban todo. Primero, pues dónde estar, cómo comer. Decíamos, ni modos que los dejemos vulnerables, porque ya están vulnerables. Pero tenemos que velar por los derechos humanos a la vida.
Guerrero es el estado donde más periodistas se han desplazado. Estamos hablando de 36 reporteros desplazados y en este momento hay 3 desaparecidos y desde hace 20 años han asesinado a 20 compañeros, ¿no?
Mientras un grupo te dice no publiques, el otro te presiona para que publiques. Pero si publicas, al rato te escribe el grupo contrario y te dice, hijo de tal por cual, ya tengo ubicada tu familia, baja eso o mañana amaneces sin cabeza. Y atribuyen que uno está trabajando para el grupo contrario.
No es exagerado, de verdad. Hay zonas de silencio ya en Guerrero. Toda la sierra, por ejemplo, tampoco no sabemos qué está pasando allí. No hay ni un solo reportero ahí. Ni un solo medio, ¿no? No quiero sonar alarmista, nada. Pero cada vez informar es imposible, ¿no? El problema de fondo es que está la información. Y lo que ellos quieren es que no salga información, pero la información es un bien público que tenemos que defender todos, no solamente nosotros.
Tengo desaparecidos a mi esposo y a mis 2 hijos. A ellos los sacaron forzosamente, así con acto de violencia de mi casa. A mí me pusieron el arma en mi cabeza y pues son hombres armados que pues vestían de policía estatales.
Colt in Connecticut, Sig Sauer in New Hampshire, Glock in Georgia, Barrett in Tennessee, Smith & Wesson in Massachusetts. They're all exporting weapons for use by police in Mexico. Those weapons have gone to military units that have forcibly disappeared dozens of people in Nuevo Laredo. They've gone to units of the police that have committed gross human rights abuses in different parts of the country.
Mi hermano Vicente se lo acaban de llevar, se lo robaron. Se lo llevaron y le dieron un balazo antes de llevárselo. Hace 1 año y medio. Y fueron los criminales junto con la policía estatal y un policía ministerial.
There's nothing like being in a room with someone and hugging someone and crying with them to really understand what their story is. You can't get that on the internet. You can't get that in a Zoom meeting. It's kind of a personal thing, you know? About dignity.
And I've met enough people in Mexico to know each one of these people matters. If we can change the way the United States is dealing with its own weapons businesses, then it could have a big impact in Mexico.
Yes. Yeah, I think these videos make it very clear the real world consequences of gun violence and also of arms transfers. Yeah, and the impact of gun violence on the Mexican people, on women, on human rights defenders, and on journalists. And therefore, I'm very pleased that Lucia is here today, who will talk with us more about this connection about gun violence and human rights violations. And I also wanted to recommend again to watch all of these testimonies and films on the Stop US Arms to Mexico playlist. Lucia, it's your turn.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you to the attendees, to my colleagues, Francesco, Leticia, Charlotte, John, Annabelle, and the colleagues to lead this important event. Oh my gosh, it's difficult to speak after the testimonies that are really accurate of what are we talking when we talk about violence and its consequences in Mexico. And it's heart trending, and the people it's not living, they are literally surviving in some parts of the country. I want to start saying that Mexico's situation of violence, insecurity, and human rights violations is critical. Just in 6 months, January to June 2023, were committed more than 300 killings with fire weapons against kids between 0 and 17 years old. And if we talk about the killings in general, we know that around 70% of them are committing by weapons. Just in 2022, 30,000 of people were murdered. We estimate that more than 300,000 persons have been internally displaced in Mexico because of the violence that we saw in the video. That's just an example of this violence that caused this internal displacement in the country. And to that, we should add the humanitarian crisis of the disappearance in the country, and more than 100,000 of people remain disappeared in Mexico. What does this have to do with arms and arms trafficking? Well, it's difficult to know the exact figure, but there are about 200,000 illegal arms entering into Mexico every year. And the arms that enter legally represent $1 million contracts with the Mexican armed forces. So the first question that we should ask ourselves then is, where does the money go? Mexican authorities are not exempt of cases of corruption or lack of transparency. And in this transaction, in fact, the issue of arms arriving legally in Mexico is highly imprecise and often unclear. Moreover, international crimes have been committed in Mexico through the use of arms, the perpetrators of which are organized crime and the Mexican army, and now also the National Guard. And that should matter to all the countries. The problem is that regardless of whether these crimes are committed, the Mexican armed forces continue receiving and distributing arms in units or corporations accused of serious human rights violations. A few weeks ago, were shown a video of a massacre and the alteration of the crime scene perpetrated by Mexican armed forces, but apparently that cases and cases as Ayotzinapa, La Tlaya, of a number of victims, children, women, it is not enough to make them major countries and exporting companies actually take steps towards the due diligence in terms of a true analysis of the result of armed violence in the country, whose characterization has been denied for several years now. International crimes and serious human rights violations are committed in Mexico with absolute impunity, and in some scenarios, the context of the war on drugs, Mexico has been in an internal armed conflict, and that analysis must be taken in consideration to stop the nonsense trafficking of guns. The government in Mexico has justified the idea of the fight against drug trafficking, and public security was militarized since 2006. This implied a larger military budget for equipment and weapons, and on the other hand, a forgetfulness of the concept of citizen security. Additionally, the federal police in Mexico, that is the national police, has disappeared, and we have only a national guard. And the situation is that the National Guard is unconstitutional and is made up of the military works under a military logic and is administered by military institution, and is like a tongue twisted, but also a legal twister that it is arbitrary. In a study that we carry out in the Mexican Commission and we update every year, we have verified that in all 12 military regions in the country, there have been cases in which serious human rights violations occur. Many of these violations involve firearms. This order with what we saw in the videos that many of the Mexican police units are in collusion with the organized crime. There are hundreds of victims in the country who were faced with a firearm that caused them at least damage or arbitrarily took their lives, as we saw also in the videos. Another issue that emerged from the lack of characterization of the phenomenon of armed violence in Mexico is the protection of civilians, that it doesn't exist. That is, the military act doesn't have a military objective, but formally they are not acting like in a war, you know? So it is this lack of characterization of the phenomenon of the violence that put us also in risk. Lastly, if we saw the weapons that the organized crime use and the weapons that the army use, as Leticia pointed previously, we can conclude that those arms are for killing, for taking another life, not for prevention. I think that in Mexico, we should be with our eyes open in order to raise awareness of the abuses that were committed in the country and take steps through the new ways of reparation and guarantees for the hundreds of thousands of victims. Again, thank you very much. And thank you to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for this very intense report about the human rights situation in Mexico and about the connection between human rights violations and firearms. Thank you very much. We've already also heard in this webinar that a lot of European brand weapons enter Mexico actually not only directly, but also directly from Europe, but also through other channels such as the US market. Therefore, I'm very pleased that John Lindsay Poland is here from Stop US Arms to Mexico, and that he will speak with us about the production sites of European brands in the US and the impact on exports to Mexico. Welcome, John, and yeah, it's your turn. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you to the European Network for organizing this in the Comisión Mexicana. Governments in the weapons industry generally say that they bear no responsibility for the violence and suffering that we've heard about. That it's simply the guy who pulls the trigger, or that the people who have been killed were killed justifiably. And at the same time, the firearms industry likes to present itself, both in Europe and in the United States, as a very traditional industry, as a very local industry. But its corporate structures are actually very integrated across international borders. And then that's true of the capital in this industry, of the ownership, of the personnel, and sometimes of the weapons parts in the same weapon. At the same time, even though the Arms Trade Treaty theoretically applies to all the nation parties, at least those that are part of it, the potentially most binding aspects of the international weapons trade are in licenses, are in export licenses and licenses to sell weapons. And the control of these licenses is more national than it is international. And even within nations, licenses are often controlled by only one sector of the state, rather than requiring a multi-sector approvals that could offer balanced criteria for where weapons should be allowed to go and who should be allowed to be end users. And all of that applies when we look at the weapons trade to Mexico. Mexico itself has a very limited weapons industry. It produces military rifles for its own army, but not for police or civilian sectors. It produces and exports hundreds of millions of bullets a year, but mostly it must import firearms and parts and munitions. And that is done exclusively through the Mexican army, which is the only entity in Mexico that is authorized to import weapons and the only one that is authorized to sell weapons to its own military units, to police, to private security companies, or to individuals. So what does that look like? I'm just going to share my screen here. This is an infographic from the report that we did in 2020 called Deadly Trade. The link is at the bottom there, and gives you a sense of the European companies that are involved in the legal export trade to Mexico. And you'll see by the national flags next to the company logos that a number of these also have production sites in the United States. It is often very difficult to know from those companies whether the weapons originated entirely in Europe or entirely in the United States or by some mix. But again, these companies are very internationally integrated. The companies themselves, Sig Sauer, Colt, and Glock are among the, and Beretta are probably the biggest in terms of volume. Although, as Leticia said, FN is very important for some of the heavier weapons that are exported to Mexico. And again, I show here all of the US locations where these European companies are exporting from, or producing, and in many cases exporting from. So let's look at the case of one of them, a powerhouse, Sig Sauer, a German company, German-owned company, still has German ownership. Its profits are still flowing back to Germany, but has largely stopped production in Germany and Switzerland, and is almost entirely producing in the United States and New Hampshire. It began that nearly 40 years ago by establishing a subsidiary in New Hampshire, and began to sell to Mexico over the succeeding years. And then it, in the 2010s, expanded its production capacity in the United States. In 2018, its CEO, Ron Cohen, who is an Israeli national, was indicted in Germany for illegal trafficking of firearms to Colombia that were produced in Germany, exported to the United States, and then shipped directly to Colombia. Despite that, Cohen continues as the CEO, and the Mexican, in 2015, the Mexican Navy got a license to, or Sig Sauer obtained a license to export an enormous amount of firearms to the Mexican Navy, many of which are as parts and are then being assembled within Mexico. Part exports do not get declared in ATT reports, in Arms Trade Treaty reports. So sometimes they are masked in the international data that we have. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, Sig Sauer exported 50,000 pistols for use by the fairly new National Guard, and continues to export an enormous number of weapons. So here we have the European companies who are taking advantage of the enormous US retail market to civilians and police particularly, but also the much more lax export rules from the United States than from Europe. Exports of firearms from the United States are now primarily controlled by the Commerce Department. That's who issues the licenses, and the Commerce Department has a mission of increasing exports. Just here's one example where it's been very difficult to obtain documentation about these export licenses. The export licenses themselves are generally restricted from public release, but you can see here from this portion of an export license for Sig Sauer that it was as a manufacturing license. In other words, these are kits that are being assembled in Mexico. The parts are produced in the United States. I want to just say a couple words about some of the companies. In the last year, in 2022, the number of European firearms exports, and Leticia touched on this, according to the ATT reports, were about 5,000. Not a very large number, primarily from Rete, from CZ, based in the Czech Republic, is an important exporter to Mexico, and a smaller number from Slovakia and Turkey. But nearly twice as many, and that reflects the same numbers that Leticia showed, were from European companies exported from the US, Glock and Sig Sauer being the biggest among them, and they're primarily exporting handguns. Now, the other market that is even bigger and is has an enormous impact in Mexico is the illicit trafficking of guns, because at least 70% of firearms, illicit firearms, recovered in Mexico, and there's an estimated 250,000 firearms trafficked from the United States into Mexico each year, come over the US-Mexico border, which is more than 3,000 kilometers long. And because the US retail market for firearms is so large, so permissive, and so militarized, it is perfect for criminal organizations or for other illicit movement of firearms into and within Mexico. Of the European weapons that are trafficked from the US into Mexico, we have only data on the firearms that are recovered and traced, which is less than 1/10 of the estimated number of trafficked firearms from the US. So the European guns that are most commonly recovered at crime scenes in Mexico are Colt. These are both handguns and long guns. Colt was acquired by CZ of the Czech Republic in 2021. for which Colt is providing profit of more than $100 million a year to CZ. And it is the gun make with the largest number of guns recovered in Mexico since 2010, with over 8,000 of those recovered by the Mexican Army. Another is Romarm, a Romanian company which makes AK-47s. They are closely connected to importers in the United States called Century Arms, which also has a large number, Century has a large number of rifles that are recovered in Mexico. So these are clearly weapons that are desired and acquired by organized crime in order to control territories and businesses within Mexico, illegal businesses. Another, of course, is Beretta, which, as we heard, is a very important legal exporter of firearms to the Mexican police, particularly. And I would note that in the case of Beretta, Beretta has a significant U.S. production, and the number of illegal firearms recovered in Mexico, there's approximately the same number of US-produced Beretta weapons as Italian-produced Beretta weapons that are illegal weapons recovered in Mexico. Glock shows most of its weapons recovered in Mexico as having been produced in Austria, even though Glock has an enormous amount of production in the United States, is also an enormous exporter of firearms around the world. And finally, I want to mention Browning, which is primarily a Belgian company, but it does have production in Italy, the United States, and Japan. Browning also produces a 50 millimeter fully automatic machine gun, which is legally exported, but sometimes they are trafficked as well. And finally, I just want to mention that Mexico has a very developed maquila sector, assembly of parts into complete products. And this does include firearms. Most of this is concentrated in 3 companies that assemble for the US firearms market. But it also includes parts that Mexico uses to produce firearms. And last year, a small number of firearms parts were shipped to Mexico from Italy, France, and Spain. So there are many ways in which the firearms industry is interlocking. There is an attempt to deny responsibility by pointing to other parts of the chain and the responsibility in the violence and suffering in Mexico from firearms, but each part plays a part. It's important for all of us to address each of those parts and the responsibility that each sector has. Thanks, and I look forward to the conversation after our presentations.
Thank you very much, John, for these insights and for listing all these different ways and channels for European brand weapons to enter Mexico. And yeah, this, of course, that the US is used as a channel also for European brand weapons to enter Mexico. This also questions or raises questions about circumventing the EU common position on arms exports. And with that also about, as you've also already mentioned, John, about corporate responsibility, about due diligence, about responsibility. And therefore it is great to have Annabelle Brüggemann here with us today, and she will give us an update on the current developments around the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and the role of the arms industry in it. Annabelle is a legal advisor at the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights within the program Economy and Human Rights. Thank you very much, Annabelle, that you're here today.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for listening, and also to my previous speakers for the interesting and really concerning information you gave us. Yes, like we already heard that arms produced in the European Union account for a really substantial part of the global arms trade. And although these arms are covered by export regulations, as the arms trade treaty and also the EU common position Charlotte just mentioned, they too often end up in states and regions where, as in Mexico, as we just heard from you, they contribute massively to violence and human rights abuses. And so while there is a lack of states' political will to ensure respect for human rights in this context, arms manufacturers companies especially are not living up to their human rights obligations either. So this responsibility of companies to respect human rights laid down in the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights and also in the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises requires arms manufacturers, like every other company in other sectors, to avoid infringing on human rights of others and address adverse human rights impacts in situations where they are involved. So this clearly includes the responsibility for the safety and foreseeable misuse of their products, regardless of the existence of any export licenses. But as has been pointed out again and again, also by the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights and a lot of civil society organizations in the last years, there are no known examples of arms companies that really conduct such proper human rights due diligence with respect to arms production, transfers, really despite the potential extremely severe impacts of this industry. So in spring last year, the European Commission issued a draft proposal for a corporate sustainability due diligence directive, shortly CSDDD or directive, which possibly could help contribute to filling these huge gaps when it comes to the accountability of European arms companies for human rights violations in their value chains. So the proposal of this directive aims to make it a legal obligation for companies operating in the EU to respect human rights and the environment by establishing a mandatory corporate due diligence duty. So to identify, stop, prevent, mitigate, and account for negative human rights impacts in its whole value chain. And also the directive should or aims to establish a civil liability if companies don't comply with their duties. So in December last year, then the European Council, as the second involved in a EU institution, published its position on this first draft of the Commission. And now in June this year, the EU Parliament, as the third institution involved, finally published its own position. So now, based on these three positions, the negotiations, so-called trialogue, just began in June. And last week, there was a second meeting. But according to various reports, there was no agreement on most of the contentious issues yet. So there will be further meetings starting in September. They are expected to be completed by the end of the year or latest beginning of next year, because the aim is to adopt this directive by the beginning of next year, at the latest before the upcoming elections to the European Parliament next spring. So when it comes to these three different positions of the Council, the Commission and the Parliament, they differ on a number of points, including the coverage of the arms sector and downstream value chains in general. So the question how ambitious this law will ultimately be will be decided in the further trilogue between these three institutions. So if we look at these three positions, when it comes to the arms sector, according to the Commission's original draft, the directive would apply to large companies, so 500 employees or more, and a minimum annual turnover of over 150 million euros from all sectors. And additionally to smaller companies, so 250 employees or more, if they belong to one of the risk sectors listed in the draft, for example, agriculture, textile, raw materials. Unfortunately, the arms sector is not listed in this proposal as such a risk sector. So according to this draft by the Commissions, only arms manufacturers above a certain size are would be covered by the directive. What is positive about this first draft is that the obligations, the human rights due diligence obligations imposed by the directive explicitly would apply to the entire value chain, so including upstream and downstream and the use of the products by the end users, which is important for the coverage of arms trade. On the other hand, if we look at the EU Council's draft, in comparison, it contains massive restrictions regarding the scope of the due diligence obligations when it comes to the weapons or arms sector. Because according to this position, the due diligence obligations would no longer apply to the entire value chain, but only to the so-called activity chain. So in particular, the use by end users, as well as the distribution and transport, storage and disposal of products that are subject to export controls for weapons, ammunition or war material are excluded from the scope of application as soon as there is a export license. So this would be really a huge restriction. And the third position of the EU Parliament would cover also smaller companies with 250 employees, not only from specific risk sectors, but all sectors. And there would be no restrictions on arms and dual-use goods once an export license has been granted. But however, in this position by the EU Parliament, the use by end users is at least not explicitly covered by the due diligence requirements, but only sales. So it's not clear yet how far or how this could be interpreted when it comes with regard to arms manufacturers to cover also arms exports. What is positive about the Parliament position is that it emphasizes that stakeholders living in conflict-affected and high-risk areas are vulnerable stakeholders, and that state that companies operating in such areas have conduct a heightened conflict-sensitive due diligence on their operations. So as we see these three positions on the table at the moment, it will really depend on the outcome of the trialogue if the future EU directive is going to be able to improve accountability of European arms manufacturers for contributing to violence and human rights violations throughout their value chains. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the international normative framework is clear, namely that the corporate obligations to respect human rights applies irrespective of the sector or the type of products and services. So if the EU is seriously committed to respect or to tackle harmful human rights impacts of EU arms manufacturers, it cannot partially or fully exempt one of the most high-risk industry from its human rights obligations. For the future EU directive to align with this international framework, it must ensure first that arms and dual use sectors are really included in the scope of the directive as high impact sectors, and that the entire value chain of the arms sector, so upstream as well as downstream activities, are included in the due diligence obligations, regardless of whether these activities are subject to national export controls in EU member states. Third, no differentiation should be established between downstream and upstream due diligence obligations. So instead, the directive should really reflect the risk-based approach, which is international standard. So according to which companies should focus their due diligence obligations in the parts of their value chain where the likelihoods of risks is most significant, irrespective whether this risk is in the upstream or downstream part of their value chain. It's also important that companies that operate or have business relations in conflict-affected and high-risk areas are to be subject to a heightened due diligence obligation, so that this is really made clear in the directive. And finally, it's important that the list of human rights covered in the scope of the directive comprises of all human rights, including also international humanitarian law, and it's not only restricted to a few international human rights treaties. Yeah, thank you for your attention, and sorry if this was a bit technical or detailed. It's yeah, it's when you go deeply into this different position, it gets a bit detailed, but I hope the main demands and were made clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle, for this also update on the current status of negotiations that are taking place, and also yeah, for your emphasis on the importance that the arms industry should be fully covered in such a directive. So now and also thank you again to all the speakers for their insights, for their contributions. And now we will have like 20 minutes, 25 minutes for also questions from the audience. We can discuss with the panelists. And as Annabelle has to leave a bit earlier, like in 10 minutes, I think, it would be good if there is questions about the due diligence directive to raise them now so that Annabelle can still answer them. You can write your questions into the Q&A tool, and then we can see them and pick them up. There is there is already one concerning the directive. It is asked if you think, Annabelle, it is likely that the CSDDD will be accepted and put into effect.
Yeah, it's difficult to say, of course, but what I hear from my colleague who is in Brussels for us, he's kind of optimistic that it's going to put into effect, but the question is really on like how it's going to look like, and if and how the arms sector is going to be covered.
Thank you very much. John raised his hand. John,
yeah,
please.
I have a question for Annabelle, also about this directive, which is, what do you think are the sectors or voices that are most influencing this process at this point? Is the weapons industry highly influential? Are there ideological strains perhaps associated with the commitment to the war in the Ukraine or the war against Russia? Are there civil society voices that are strongly influencing this, or are there other sectors that are strongly influencing this process? What do you think is shaping the process as you see it right now?
Yeah, I think there are different actors there, and it's one problem also is it's really not that transparent, of course, who is trying to influence what behind closed doors. But yeah, the arms sector is active, and also what is really where there's really a huge pressure is when it comes to the financial sector. I haven't mentioned it yet because I focus now on the arms sector, but it's there at the moment in most of the proposals. There are huge exceptions for the financial sector. But then also from a lot of different sectors, there's a lot of lobbying going on when it comes to, especially to civil liability, and the whole question of they want to have like at least they want to avoid civil liability, or at least have some kind of safe harbor where they can say, if I just join one multi-stakeholder initiative, I'm off the hook. So these are the main battlegrounds at the moment, as far as I can see.
And we're having a follow-up question on the directive. The question if there are certain states championing the inclusion of arms industry in this in the directive. I think Annabelle, this also would go to you, but also if others want to add something, feel free.
Yeah, it's actually not that clear because it shifts a little bit when it comes to the council, like the positions of that in the council, or to individual members of parliaments and so on. So it's really not so easy to really identify states who are really in favor of it. It's clear that, for example, unfortunately, Germany is not one of them at the moment. Maybe someone else wants to add or has some more insights there.
Yes, Leticia, please.
Yes, briefly. I think also we know that France is one of the countries which is working hard in excluding, of course, the arms industry. I don't know which countries are in favor of including it, but I know which one is not, definitely France. And that also joins the question of John, which the problem we face in Europe is that we have not only the arms industry lobbying for its interests, but also a number of governments, and France is one of the first ones who are also actively lobbying for the interests of the arms industry. And that the current context of the war in Ukraine is indeed making it quite difficult in the European Parliament also to address arms-related issues in a critical way, even though you would address things that have nothing to do with Ukraine. There is a very general pro-arms atmosphere which makes the lobbying quite complicated, or advocating on this issue quite complicated, I would say. So yeah, just a small remark. I don't have much more to share, and unfortunately we don't have the capacity to follow that too much, but yeah, that's the point. There was also a question from Nawel asking who we should contact for advocacy. I think ECCA chair, so Annabelle, you and Ben are one of the main organizations from the civil society side working on that. Am I right?
Yes, we are actively, mainly my colleague Ben, who is really, would be a good point to ask there, because I'm not involved in the in the active advocacy part, but he is. So, but if there are like a concrete interest in advocacy or addressing someone, I could put you in touch with Ben.
Yes, thank you, Annabelle. And now maybe because there have been there has been a question. It was already answered in written format, but maybe just so that everybody also knows about the answer, we can also now answer it live. It was a question: if besides use by state forces, do you have any information of how guns are marketed to civilians in Mexico, including cartel members? For example, the nexus between mainstream harmful masculinities and access and use of guns. Yeah, Lucia, please. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Charlotte. As I write in the question and answers space, hi, Angelica. As I said, only Sedena could sell this kind of arms that are not only for the use of army to civilians in Mexico. And actually, it is very easy. I mean, almost everyone can buy an arm in the store of the Sedena, who is in Mexico City. And related with this gender and masculinity and the use of firearms, the firearms have been used as a tool of power and control of women's and other I don't know, the LGBT community and poor people. And in order with that, women has been used as war weapon. So I think that the military actions and operation are patriarchal And the security strategies, as Mexican security strategy, are related with violent control of the civilians. And I think that we have to think the violence related with patriarchal methods. So we have to rethink also the city security, the citizen security with these without these patriarchal methods of weapons and fight against drugs. And yes, I think it is a really interesting question, because if we see the numbers of killings in Mexico, we can show that the most of people who are killing are men. But there is a difference between the women's, how the women's are killing and why, and the killings of men. So it is like a very interesting kind of see the violence if we see these patriarchal methods of violence.
Thank you very much, Lucia. I see that Jeff Abramson has raised his hand. Yeah, please.
Hey, thanks so much. I tried to write the question out too, but I guess it's a question about how this issue is seen within the Mexican government itself. The Mexico is kind of a leader on the ATT. It's doing some really interesting things to stop illegal arms trafficking from the United States. But at the same time, I assume it's not putting any pressure on European countries to stop legal transfers to Mexico. So I just sort of wonder how within Mexico itself this issue is tackled, and is it kind of bifurcated? Is it kind of thought of in I'm willing to talk about X issue but not Y issue because of the position of the country? And if I could, I think from across the border, it does look like the government of Mexico has a lot of challenges in terms of human rights itself. So I'm wondering how to play this issue, if that makes sense. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Before we answer this question, I just wanted to, because I think Annabelle has to leave now, so I just wanted to say thank you again to you, Annabelle, for participating. And yeah, thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you so much for the interesting insights and discussions. See you. Bye.
Bye. Okay, so yeah, back to the question, Lucia. Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you. We have two problems in Mexico, that it is the illegal trafficking, as Jess pointed out, but also, as he pointed out, the legal trafficking, because as I said, there is a lot of, that we have 12 military regions in Mexico, and all of them have been committed human rights violations, and all of them continue receiving weapons in order to fight against drug trafficking, but also organized crime, but also to do some other activities that are not related with these kind of public security issues. I mean, now the armed forces has the faculty to do other kind of operation as administrative faults, like if someone throw garbage in the street, the armed forces can arrest this person. So it is a very complicated issue, because in this context, they're committed at serious human rights violations also. And the other thing is that the Mexican government are pointing out that the issue of violence, it is just related with organized crime and with the arms that illegally come in Mexico. But that doesn't true. Since 2006, the government sold us a story where the problem is that the organized crime are fighting against the military units, or that the organized crime are fighting between themselves in order to take the control of the territory and the illegal activities. And that's the same in all country, but that doesn't, it is not true. There are places in the country that you don't need the army. There are places in the country that the biggest problem, it is not the organized crime. It is the robbering of car parts, or it is the kidnapping, that it is a felony that should be prosecuted by the local police. So we have this like this story that in every part of the country the violence is similar, and the military, it is justified, and the military should be there in order to protect the population, but it doesn't true. And it has the consequence that we have a very, very big business of buying weapons to European companies, but also to US. And it doesn't stop because they're justified this kind of violence in all the national territory. So there are like two problems. One is, in conclusion, one is the illegal trafficking, that it is a big problem in Mexico. And I think it is responsibility of United States, but also the Mexican government. And in the other hand, there is a problem that it is also a sharing problem, that it is that in Mexico, the police and the military officers are committed crimes with the use of weapons, and the companies and the countries continue selling weapons to Mexican authorities without an analysis of these human rights abuses. And as I said, more than a human rights abuses, there are crimes, international crimes that are committed in Mexico in some parts of the territory. So I don't know if Jeff, I answer accurate your question.
Thank you, Lucia. And also John raised his hand. Please, John.
Yeah, just to add to what Lucia said, which I completely concur with, is, you know, it might seem that the Mexican government discourse on legal imports of firearms and illicit trafficking of firearms are very inconsistent with each other. But there is one kind of thread that goes across that, especially in this government of the López Obrador government, which is a very nationalistic kind of rhetoric. So the trafficking is pointed to as an external problem, right? This is something that is coming from the United States. Mexico can point the finger at the United States. And of course, we completely agree that the United States bears an enormous responsibility for those weapons that are flowing illegally over the border. But for the legal trade too, the López Obrador government has said, well, we've got that taken care of, and we will increase our own production of weapons. It is not yet distributing those weapons to police or the private sector. Those weapons are still only for the military, but that is part of the discourse of the López Obrador government, is we will depend less on external sectors for imports, and therefore any kinds of controls. I think that might be more rhetorical than the government has so far been able to implement. But certainly, as the Comisión Mexicana has documented very well, the López Obrador government has increased the authority and the budget for the Mexican military in ways that, with a very nationalist kind of discourse that enables the military to escape controls, to escape responsibility and accountability, both for crimes that it commits, but also for any kind of transparency around the weapons trade, both coming into the country as well as internally within the country.
Thank you very much to you, Lucia, and to you, John, for answering this question. At the moment, I don't see another question in the tool. So I would have a question also to all of you, because I think we've seen today that, of course, human rights issues and the issue on arms transfer are so closely connected. And I think we've seen today how important this connection is. So my question would be to you, what we also as civil society can do to foster this connection, and also to continue with this cooperation between also human rights organizations and arms export control organizations. Yes, please, Lucia.
I will start with just one idea, that it is the international mission that you did in last February, that it is very useful, I think, for the advocacy, for the raising awareness to the authorities in Mexico about this problem of weapons, but also to share information with the civil society, but most important, the victims, and to split these testimonies as you did with these important and very sensitive videos that was like this part, with this important part of the mission. So I think that maybe a first step should be the raising awareness, and with civil society in your countries, but also with the Mexican government in order to take steps to end the violence. And as I said in my first participation, with civil society NGOs, and I mean Mexican civil society and the civil society in other parts of the world, to keep our eyes open in order to point it out and make these complaints regarding with the violence and the human rights abuses that are committed with weapons in Mexico, but also in other parts of the world, as you said, for example, in Ukraine, that it is also a big problem, this weapons situation.
Thank you, Lucia. John, yeah, please.
Yes, to everything Lucia said. I asked the question of Annabella partly about who is influencing the directives, because I think it is possible that civil society can influence these processes. It requires opening up the closed doors behind which these negotiations are occurring. And I think that starts with groups in different countries, different communities in Europe, writing to their, getting together, coordinating, saying that we want to know what's going on, we're interested in what's going on, that this is not just something about the Ukraine, this is something that impacts people all around the world where European weapons are exported. I also think, that exports to the United States should be included in that. The US market is a high-risk market. It's a very, very high-risk market, both for violence within the United States and for weapons that are trafficked outside the market. I also think that, as someone referenced it in one of the videos, that face-to-face contact with people who are impacted is transformative, and that any of you who have an opportunity to visit Mexico in order to connect with people who are working on this, who are impacted by this, or invite people from Mexico to your communities in Europe. It really does have an impact. It might be a small number of people, but those number of people can be very motivated. And then finally, yes, sharing more of the information. The videos that you saw are going to be, there's going to be German versions with German subtitles that are made. They're right now in English and Spanish, and we hope that you do share them on social media and other ways. And of course, the recording of this webinar to get to your members, to people you know, your networks, is just an important way to keep this moving.
Thank you. I think we have one last question in the Q&A before we're going to wrap up. It is about, the question is, AMLO has increased the role of the military in taking on civilian projects like Tren Maya, but those should not involve arms. Has the military arms budget greatly increased along with their increased role?
Do you want to take that, Lucia?
Sorry, it cuts and I didn't listen.
It's in the Q&A. So it's a question
sorry.
about...
Oh, okay, the Q&A.
Now it's in answered. Switch to answered. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, actually, the AMLO administration has increased the role of the military, not only with regarding public security, but also with other functions that are more like administrative functions, that it is also dangerous because it has a direct impact in the democratic state. I mean, we are maybe it is not so sexy to say that, but it is, we are very close to the Cuban model of economy, where the military are closer to the enterprise and the economical model in the government. They are assuming more than 200 functions that they didn't have before this administration. For example, the Tren Maya, the constructions activities as the airports and the trains and the facilities of the National Guard, but also the control of import and exports and the maritime issues. So it is like a very dangerous situation, because the AMLO's government are giving more power and more not only more political, but also economical power to armed forces. So as you said, Meishu, it doesn't involve weapons necessarily, but we can't forget that the military has the control of the weapons. So always that you give more power, political and economic power in to the military, it is a decrease of the democratic institutions, and also it is like a strange the capability of the military. Yes, of the militaries. And oh, sorry. And yes, I will say that, and maybe also that when if we are seeing in this last administration that the political power of the military, because they have more money, more resources, and more power in the decision of the public administration, is being increased also. For example, when the Congress was discussing the reforms of the National Guard law, the militaries were very aggressive, I said, in order to negotiate with the politicians this law. So they have right now a very strong political power. So instead, it doesn't involve weapons. It is dangerous in order to the democratic state and the democratic of the democracy of Mexican state.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I think we are nearly, the time is nearly over, and I want to thank again very much to all the speakers and the organizers, and also the technical support, also to the audience with all the questions. And I also want to mention that there is an ENAAT briefing note together with Rete, Disarmo, and Ohne, Rüstung, Leben on the topics we've discussed today. It is available on the ENAAT website. We will also share the link in the chat. Yeah, and I think that we can conclude that it is important to continue connecting this issue of human rights violations and arms exports to Mexico, and we hope to expand and continue this cooperation with human rights groups, both at EU level but also on the national levels, in the countries of ENAAT members that also participated in the delegations, such as Germany, Belgium, and Italy. And I think it really became clear, and John, you also already mentioned it, that the experiences of this delegation has shown how important also the international cooperation is. And another thing I think we've seen today is that it's also very important to connect this topic with the due diligence and corporate social responsibility topic, because we've heard that companies are now searching for new channels, trying to escape their responsibilities, and that something like a due diligence directive could be one tool to ensure to hold the companies accountable. Yeah, so again, thank you very much to all participants and the audience for attending, and yeah, have a nice evening. Thank you very much.